Manhattan was wrapped in the kind of cold that turned breath into smoke and ambition into silence. Ethan Hale stood before the mirrored glass of Hale Technologies, the company his father had built from the ground up. The tower rose into the gray winter sky, its sharp lines slicing through clouds like a monument to success. But inside those walls, whispers had begun to spread. Employees complained of corruption. Managers looked the other way. The press called the company soulless, and Ethan, the 35-year-old billionaire who had inherited it all, was beginning to believe they were right. He watched as workers hurried through the revolving doors, heads down coffee, in hand badges flashing. Once this sight had filled him with pride. Now it filled him with doubt. His father had always said, a company is only as honest as the people cleaning its floors. But lately Ethan suspected those floors were polished with fear rather than pride. He had read the anonymous complaints online, the messages from janitors fired for speaking out the accusations that supervisors pocketed bonuses while cutting overtime pay. The more he learned, the more he realized he had become detached from the people who kept the lights on after dark. That morning, standing in the biting wind, Ethan made a decision. No press release, no official visit, no security detail. He would see the truth himself, not as Ethan Hale, CEO billionaire and heir to an empire, but as someone invisible. By sunset, the plan was set. He told his executive assistant he was leaving the city for a private retreat. In reality, he drove 3 blocks away, parked his Bentley in an underground garage, and changed into a gray janitor's uniform ordered from an online supplier. The fabric was stiff and smelled faintly of bleach. He tucked a name tag onto his chest. Evan Hart. The alias was forgettable, exactly what he needed. At 8 p.m., when most of the executives had gone home, Ethan entered his own building through the side service door. The smell of industrial cleaner hit him immediately, a mixture of lemon and chemicals. The elevator refused to respond to his key card. For the first time in years, he took the stairs, feeling the echo of his footsteps bounce off concrete walls. On the 12th floor, the operations department buzzed with low light and fatigue. A group of night shift employees sat near the vending machines. None of them looked up as Ethan passed. He picked up a mop from the closet and began his first task, cleaning the hallway outside the executive offices. The floor was cold slick and reflected his own distorted image back at him. Half an hour passed before anyone noticed him. A middle-aged supervisor in a pressed shirt stopped, frowning. "You missed a spot," the man snapped, pointing to a patch of floor that gleamed perfectly. "Do it again. We keep standards here." Ethan nodded without a word. His throat tightened with the strange mixture of anger and shame. He had written the company's code of ethics himself, yet here he was being spoken to like he was dust on a shoe. 2 accountants walked by laughing. One whispered loudly enough for him to hear, "New janitor looks too clean for the job." They both chuckled and disappeared into the elevator. Ethan kept mopping. Every stroke of the mop was a confession. Every drop of dirty water was proof of how far he had drifted from the world beneath him. Hours crawled by. The building grew quieter until only the hum of the heating system and the faint tapping of a keyboard remained. Ethan's hands ached. His back protested every motion. He looked down at his fingers. Calluses were forming. It was a pain he had never known, and yet it felt more honest than any board meeting he had attended. Close to midnight, while scrubbing the floor near the lobby, he accidentally knocked over a bucket. The dirty water splashed across the polished tiles and the shoes of a passing department manager. The man exploded. "Are you blind? Do you know how much those shoes cost?" He raised his voice until it echoed down the empty corridor. "You people can't do a single thing right." Ethan froze. The man stormed off, cursing under his breath. Ethan bent down to wipe the mess shoulders, trembling not with fear, but with disbelief. Was this what his company had become? A place where arrogance passed for authority and cruelty for leadership. He stayed on his knees cleaning when he noticed a shadow approach. Soft footsteps. Then a gentle voice cut through the silence. "You don't have to rush," the woman said. "He shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Ethan looked up. She wore the Navy uniform of the security team, her badge reading C. Monroe. Her eyes were tired, yet bright, framed by loose strands of brown hair, escaping her bun. She crouched beside him, offering a paper towel. He took it, surprised. "Thank you," he murmured. She shrugged. "You don't talk much, do you?" "Not really." She studied him for a moment, then smiled a small, unguarded smile that warmed the fluorescent corridor. "You don't talk much, but I can tell you're not invisible." The words sank deep, cutting through the armor he had worn for years. Invisible. That was what he had wanted to be, and yet hearing it said that way felt like being seen for the first time. As she walked away, Ethan found himself staring at the reflection of the mop in the shining floor. For the first time in a long while, the man in the mirror didn't look like a CEO. He looked human. The next evening, the city breathed in a dull rhythm of lights and sirens. Snow from the previous night had turned to slush, coating the sidewalks in gray mirrors. Ethan arrived at the building before his shift began, blending easily among the invisible, the delivery men, the night cleaners, the ones who kept the city alive while others slept. He pulled his hood low and scanned his ID badge marked Evan Hart. No one looked twice. The marble lobby gleamed beneath white fluorescent lights. Security guards rotated shifts behind the glass counter. And there she was again, Clara Monroe, the woman who had spoken to him as if he mattered. She was signing a report, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't notice him until he dropped his bucket, the clang echoing across the empty space. Her head lifted, and for a fleeting second, she smiled in recognition. "You came back," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Didn't think the yelling scared you off." "I've heard worse," Ethan replied softly. She laughed under her breath, the sound light and unguarded. "That's the spirit. Welcome to the graveyard shift where time moves slower than coffee drips." He found himself smiling, which felt strange after years of stiff boardroom expressions. She gestured to the staff room near the security desk. "If you need warmth, there's a heater in there. Management forgets janitors are human." The word struck him harder than she intended. Human. A simple word, but one his world had quietly erased. He nodded. "Thanks." As he worked, he watched her move through the corridors with quiet efficiency, greeting every late-night worker by name. When a courier dropped a stack of boxes, she helped him lift them without hesitation. When a young intern spilled her coffee, Clara handed her tissues, saying, "Happens to everyone." The other guards barely looked up from their screens. Clara did everything without asking for credit. It wasn't duty, it was instinct. She was the kind of person who noticed what others ignored. Around midnight, Ethan was mopping near the entrance when she approached with 2 paper cups. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," she said, offering one. "It's not much, but it's hot." He hesitated, unused to such simple kindness. "You didn't have to, neither did you," she said, nodding toward the spotless floor. "But you're here cleaning up after people who don't say thank you, so cheers to the invisible ones." They clinked cups like comrades in some quiet rebellion. He took a sip. The coffee was cheap and slightly burnt, but it tasted more real than the espresso from his penthouse machine. He glanced at her badge again. Clara Monroe. That's a strong name. "Army," she said simply. "Sergeant for 6 years. After my mom got sick, I came home. Needed something steady." She paused, then added with a wry smile. "Turns out guarding a building full of millionaires pays less than guarding a base in Iraq." Ethan studied her face, the mix of strength and exhaustion, the faint scar near her temple. She had seen more of the world than he ever had, yet she carried herself without bitterness. "Your mother, how's she doing?" he asked gently. Clara's eyes softened. "Heart failure. Some good days, some bad. I pick up extra shifts to cover meds. She's stubborn, though. Says she'll outlive me just to prove a point." She chuckled, though her voice cracked slightly at the end. Ethan felt a pull in his chest, something unfamiliar yet undeniably human. He wanted to help, but help from a stranger would insult her pride. So he just said, "She's lucky to have you." Maybe she murmured, "But sometimes I think I'm the lucky one. Taking care of her reminds me what matters." The night stretched long. Outside snow began to fall again, soft flakes floating past the glass like quiet witnesses. Ethan cleaned and Clara walked her rounds, occasionally stopping to chat. Each time she shared pieces of herself. Stories about her mother's stubborn humor, about stray cats she fed behind the loading dock, about dreams she had put on hold. Ethan listened more than he spoke, afraid that any wrong word would break the fragile truth between them. Around 2 a.m, an older janitor named Luis walked by and muttered, "You're wasting time talking. We get paid by the floor, not by the minute." Clara shot him a look. "We also get paid for being decent. Try it sometime." Ethan bit back a smile as Luis grumbled away. Clara turned to him and shrugged. "People are tired. Tired makes mean." "You don't seem mean," Ethan said. "You haven't seen me when the heater breaks." She smiled, and for a moment it was easy to forget the cold, the mop the weight of his secret. When her radio crackled, she excused herself to respond to a noise on the loading dock. Ethan followed quietly, at a distance, curiosity tugging at him. In the alley, a stray dog shivered beside the dumpsters. Clara crouched, pulling a sandwich from her pocket. "Here you go, buddy," she whispered, tearing it in half. "Don't bite me and we'll get along." Ethan stepped closer. "Why help it? It'll just come back tomorrow." She glanced at him, the snow catching in her hair. "Then I'll feed it again. Doesn't cost much to be kind." He didn't know what to say. The simplicity of it stripped him bare. For all his millions, he couldn't recall the last time he had done something that pure. They stood in silence as the dog ate the snow, muffling the city's distant noise. Clara straightened and gave him a look, somewhere between teasing and concern. "You okay, Evan? You look like someone who forgot how to breathe." "Maybe I did." "Well," she said softly, "breathe now. It's free." When she walked back inside, Ethan lingered. The cold seeped through his gloves, but inside him something had warmed. Later, in the janitor's locker room, he opened a small notebook he had found in the supply closet and began to write. Not company memos, not strategy notes, just fragments of what he saw. Night 1, he wrote, "One woman, a heart that still believes kindness matters." He paused, then added, "She reminded me that being seen isn't the same as being known." He closed the notebook and sat in silence until dawnlight began to bleed through the windows, turning the dirty glass a soft gold. For the first time in years, he didn't dread the sunrise. He was beginning to feel alive again. The third night arrived with a storm rolling in from the Hudson, the kind of rain that slicked the city in silver and whispered against every window pane. Ethan arrived early again, long before his shift officially started, just to feel the quiet of the building before the fluorescent lights hummed to life. He had begun to learn the rhythm of this hidden world, the smell of bleach at the start of every shift, the low chatter of the cleaning crew swapping gossip and aches, the hollow thud of mop buckets rolling over marble floors. For the first time, he was living inside the heartbeat of the company instead of ruling it from above. Clara arrived a few minutes later, shaking the rain from her jacket. "Evening, Evan," she said, smiling as she passed the front desk. "You ready to fight the good fight again?" "Always," he said, though his voice carried more warmth than humor. He realized he looked forward to her voice now, the way it filled the silence like music played just for him. As the hours passed, Ethan cleaned side by side, with the other janitors listening more than speaking. They talked about the price of groceries, the pain in their backs, their kids' school projects, and how management never said thank you. One man joked that the executives probably didn't even know janitors had names. Ethan forced a chuckle, hiding how deeply that truth pierced him. He had once signed paychecks for hundreds of employees, yet he couldn't recall the name of a single one who worked after dark. Around midnight, Clara appeared again with 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept in years," she teased, handing him one. "It's becoming your signature look. I'll consider rebranding," he said with a grin that surprised him. She laughed a short, honest sound. "Careful humor like that might get you promoted." He took a sip. The coffee was as bitter as the last one, but her presence made it taste almost sweet. For a long moment they stood near the window, watching rain streak down the glass, distorting the city lights into trembling rivers of gold. "You ever wonder," Clara said quietly, "how many people clean up messes they didn't make?" He turned to her. "Every day, probably." "Yeah," she said. "It's weird, isn't it? We spend our lives fixing things for people who don't even see us. But maybe that's what keeps the world from falling apart, the people no one thanks." Her words lingered steady and true. Ethan thought of the boardroom speeches he had given about efficiency and innovation. None of them had ever sounded half as wise as what she had just said. Later that night, while wiping down the break room tables, Ethan heard laughter echoing from the corridor. A supervisor was berating a young janitor for spilling soap water. The boy's face flushed red as he stammered apologies. "You think this place runs itself?" the supervisor barked. "If you can't do simple work, maybe you should leave." Ethan's jaw tightened. He wanted to intervene to reveal himself and put the man in his place, but that would destroy his disguise. Then Clara appeared, walking straight into the scene. "Hey, that's enough," she said, calm but firm. He already apologized. The supervisor sneered. "Stay out of this, Clara. You're not in charge." "No," she said, "but I'm still a human being, and so is he. Treat him like one." The silence that followed was thick, The supervisor muttered something under his breath and walked off. The boy whispered a thank you, and Clara patted his shoulder before moving on. Ethan stood frozen, his heart pounding. He had seen board members crumble under pressure, but this woman, a security guard, had just faced down authority without blinking. That night, as he mopped beside her, he said quietly, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but if I didn't, I'd have to see it in my head all night. I can't sleep with that kind of noise." He nodded, understanding more than he expected. They worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. As he wrung out his mop, he glanced at her hands, strong, calloused, and unpolished. The kind of hands that held the world together without anyone noticing. Near the loading dock, a stray dog waited again, tail wagging. Clara pulled out another sandwich, crouching with a soft smile. Ethan watched from a few feet away. "You again," she murmured to the dog. "Guess loyalty still exists somewhere." He stepped closer. "You could take it home." She shook her head. "Can't. My landlord barely tolerates me. Besides, I like it here, free spirit, no leash." Her words made him smile. "You remind me of that dog," he said. "Free spirit, no leash." She laughed. "Careful, Evan. You're learning how to talk like a poet." He looked at her, then really looked, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The way her eyes held both strength and sorrow. The way she hid exhaustion behind humor. She wasn't just surviving, she was enduring with grace. The realization hit him like a slow tide. He wasn't observing her anymore, he was drawn to her. Hours later, when the shift ended, he walked her to the exit. The storm had passed, leaving the city washed clean under the pale glow of streetlights. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked as she adjusted her hood. "Sometimes," he said. "Mostly, I think." "About what? About how people forget to care." She tilted her head. "You talk like someone who lost something." "Maybe I did," he said softly. "Then I hope you find it." She gave him one last smile before disappearing into the misty morning. Ethan stood there long after she left, feeling the echo of her presence like warmth that refused to fade. Later in his notebook he wrote, "She fed a stray tonight. Not because she had much, but because she couldn't bear to look away." He stared at the words, realizing they weren't about the dog at all. They were about her, and maybe about him too. As dawn broke, he stepped outside, the cold air biting his skin. The skyscrapers glistened each window, catching the first light of morning. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan Hale, the billionaire who owned the view, felt like he was finally beginning to see it. The nights had begun to blend together into one long rhythm of footsteps, humming lights and whispered conversations between two people who had started to orbit each other without realizing it. Ethan now knew exactly when Clara's shift began, when she'd take her first round through the lobby, when she'd pause by the break room to refill her thermos. Sometimes she would find him already mopping the corridor outside the elevator, pretending not to wait for her, though both of them knew he was. The world above them, the one filled with suits, meetings, and polished smiles, had no idea what was unfolding under its feet. Down here beneath the fluorescent light that painted everything in shades of gray, something human was taking root. That evening, Clara brought him another cup of coffee, this one slightly warmer than usual. "You ever sleep?" she asked, teasing him, with the same grin she wore every night. "Occasionally," he said, "usually when the world feels less noisy." She leaned against the wall, sipping her drink. Then I guess you'll never sleep in this building. The noise here isn't sound, it's energy. Everyone's trying so hard to look important, they forget to be kind. Ethan smiled faintly. You sound like someone who's been disappointed by people. Haven't we all? She replied, then added more softly. But disappointment doesn't mean you stop believing. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant hum of the air vents. He studied her profile, the curve of her jaw, the faint scar that ran near her temple, the steadiness of her eyes. She wasn't beautiful in the fragile, polished way of the women he met at charity galas. She was real, unfiltered, the kind of beauty that came from endurance. You were in the army, right? He asked. She nodded. 6 years, learned discipline, teamwork, and how to sleep standing up. And now you're here keeping watch over a building that doesn't even notice. I don't mind, she said, shrugging. It's quiet. After the chaos of war, quiet feels like luxury. Even this kind of quiet, he asked, glancing at the empty hallway. Especially this kind. She smiled, a small flicker of warmth in the sterile corridor. Besides, I like watching people. You can tell who they really are by how they treat those they don't need. Her words sank into him like rain soaking dry earth. For years he had prided himself on his business intuition, his ability to read markets and people. But Clara's kind of insight came from a different place, the heart. He envied it. Later that night, while cleaning the 11th floor, Ethan overheard raised voices coming from the finance office. He paused behind the half-open door. Marcus Barlow, the head of finance, stood over a young custodian named Jace, berating him for using the wrong polish on the marble. You idiots ruin everything, Marcus hissed. You think anyone cares about your excuses? You're lucky you even have a job. Ethan's stomach turned. Marcus had been with the company for years, a man Ethan had trusted to manage millions. Seeing him now red-faced and cruel made Ethan's blood boil. He pulled out a small body camera, clipped to his belt, something every janitor was issued for safety, and quietly turned it on. This was part of his test. The loyalty test wasn't just about finding corruption at the top. It was about finding the truth of how power moved through the building. Marcus shoved a form toward Jace. Sign this. You'll take the blame for the damaged marble. If you refuse, you're out. Ethan stepped back before he could be seen, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. He knew exactly what he had to do. The next morning, Clara's report appeared in the digital log. She had documented the entire incident, citing verbal abuse and unethical conduct, even though Marcus was technically above her rank. Ethan read the report from the maintenance terminal, feeling a strange mix of pride and admiration. She had no idea he had been there, no idea he had captured it all yet. She still did the right thing. The courage it took to challenge authority in a place that rewarded silence was more than he could measure. When he saw her later, he said nothing at first. He simply nodded at her as she walked by, and she raised an eyebrow, puzzled by the faint smile tugging at his lips. What's that look for? She asked. Just thinking, he said. About people who do the right thing even when no one's watching? She tilted her head, curious. Sounds like something a good man would say. Maybe I'm trying to become one, he replied quietly. Her gaze softened, but before she could respond, the radio on her belt crackled with static. She excused herself and disappeared down the hall. Ethan stood alone, listening to the fading echo of her footsteps. That night, when the others left for their smoke breaks, he and Clara ended up in the break room together. The clock ticked toward 2 in the morning. A flickering light buzzed above them, casting faint shadows across the tile. "Do you ever miss the army?" he asked. "Sometimes," she said. "I miss the purpose, the feeling that what I did mattered. Here it's just rules and rotations. You still make a difference," he said. "You keep people safe." "Maybe, but most days no one even notices." "I notice," he said before realizing how much weight those 2 words carried. Her eyes met his, startled, then softened. "You're strange, Evan. You talk like someone who's lived too many lives." "Maybe I have," he said with a half smile. She laughed quietly. "Then maybe it's not about rebuilding, but about becoming someone new." They sat in that flickering light, sharing quiet stories, his fabricated tales of a failed small business, her real ones about hospital visits and long nights caring for her mother. Every word drew them closer, stitching an invisible thread between their lives. At one point, her hand brushed his when she reached for the sugar packet, and the smallest spark leapt through him. She didn't seem to notice, but he did. It was the first time in years that someone's touch had made him feel alive instead of restless. When her shift ended, Clara stood stretching. "Try to get some sleep, philosopher," she said with a teasing smile. "Even invisible men need rest." "I'll sleep when you do," he answered softly. She rolled her eyes but smiled as she walked away, her reflection fading into the polished glass. Ethan sat alone for a long while, after she left the hum of the lights filling the air like a quiet heartbeat. In his pocket, he still carried the footage from the night before, proof of the cruelty that hid behind the company's polished image, but also proof of one woman's courage. He opened his notebook and wrote a single line. "Under the harshest light, she shines the brightest." Then he closed it, knowing something had shifted forever. The night the truth began to crack open started like any other with the hum of vacuum cleaners and the faint rhythm of rain against glass. Ethan arrived an hour early again, pretending to check supply closets and refill soap dispensers, but his mind was far from janitorial work. The footage of Marcus berating the young custodian still haunted him, and Clara's written report had confirmed what he already knew: his company had rotted from the inside out. He had spent weeks living as Evan Hart, watching how power moved through the building, how small people were crushed under quiet cruelty, and how one woman had stood against it all. But that night he knew the disguise was running out of time. Something inside him was unraveling. At around 10 o'clock, the fire alarm flickered red and the floor monitors began to beep. A cybersecurity breach warning appeared across multiple terminals in the operations wing. Clara was the first to notice, rushing to the security room where screens flashed lines of code. "It's not a drill," she said into her radio. "We've got a live hack, looks like the main servers." Ethan followed her inside, pretending to be confused, but his pulse quickened when he recognized the pattern of intrusion on the monitors. It wasn't random. Whoever had breached the system was using internal credentials someone high up. He glanced at the code again and saw a signature he'd seen before, one used by the finance department to access restricted data. Marcus. Without thinking, Ethan slid into the chair next to Clara and began typing. "What are you doing?" she asked, startled. "Trust me," he said quickly, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He accessed back-end firewalls, disabling the breach pathways in seconds. Clara stared at him. "How do you know what you're doing?" she asked, incredulous. "You're supposed to be cleaning floors." He didn't answer. The screen went black, then rebooted with the message, "Access restored. Threat neutralized." Ethan leaned back, exhaling. For the first time since taking on the disguise, he had slipped. Clara was watching him closely now. "That wasn't janitor stuff," she said slowly. "Who are you, really?" He looked at her, and for a moment, the truth nearly escaped his lips. But before he could respond, 2 IT managers burst into the room, demanding to know who authorized system access. Ethan stood stepping away from the computer. "I just followed her orders," he said, nodding at Clara. The managers barely glanced at him before turning to her, questioning her authority to bring in unqualified personnel. She tried to defend herself, but the tension in the room grew thick. Ethan left quietly, knowing this lie could only hold for so long. The next morning, chaos erupted. An internal memo spread across, department's major data breach, security protocols under review, several employees under investigation. By noon, word had reached Marcus, who immediately blamed the janitorial staff for tampering with sensitive equipment. Ethan listened as rumors spread through the lower floors. "They say the janitor was caught using the CEO's clearance codes," someone whispered. "Probably stole them." "He's finished," another voice said. "Fired, maybe arrested." Ethan stayed silent, pushing his mop like nothing had changed, though the walls of his double life were closing in. When Clara approached him during her patrol, her expression was tight, conflicted. "They're saying you accessed restricted systems," she whispered. "Tell me it's not true." He hesitated. "It's not what they think." "Then what is it?" she pressed. He looked around the corridor, empty except for the echo of their voices. "I can't explain yet," he said quietly. "Not here." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" He wanted to deny it, to hold on to the fragile peace they'd built. But before he could answer, Marcus appeared at the end of the hallway with 2 security officers. "That's him," Marcus said, his voice sharp. "Caught red-handed." The guards approached. "We need to search your locker," one said. Ethan raised his hands calmly. "Go ahead." In the janitor's closet, the officers found nothing except cleaning supplies and a small notebook, the one he'd used to write his reflections. Marcus snatched it, flipping through the pages, his lips curling, when he saw the line about corruption and cruelty. "Poetry," he sneered. "Touching." "Maybe you can write about unemployment next." Clara stepped forward. "That's enough, Marcus. Stay out of this," he snapped. "You're already on thin ice for that little report of yours." Ethan clenched his fists, the urge to end the charade burning in his chest. "Don't talk to her like that," he said, his voice low but steady. Marcus laughed. "Or what, you'll mop me to death?" The room erupted into uneasy silence. Then from the doorway, a familiar voice cut through. "That's quite enough, Marcus." Everyone turned. The head of corporate security, a tall man named Henderson, stood there holding a file. "The board has been informed. Turns out the system logs trace the breach back to your terminal, not his." Marcus's face drained of color. "That's impossible." "We'll see," Henderson said coldly. "In the meantime, you're suspended pending investigation." The guards escorted Marcus away, his protests echoing down the hall. Clara exhaled, relief flooding her face. "Looks like justice found its way through the mess," she said softly. Ethan almost smiled, but the moment was short-lived. Henderson turned to him. "Mr. Hale," he said formally, "the board wants to speak with you immediately." The words hung in the air like thunder. Clara's brows furrowed. What did he just call you? Ethan's heart pounded. There was no escaping now. He straightened, removed the worn badge from his chest, and set it on the cart. Ethan Hale, he said quietly, CEO of this company. Clara stared unblinking, as if the ground beneath her had shifted. You lied to me. I had to, he said quickly. I needed to see what was happening here. I needed to know the truth. The truth, she repeated, her voice trembling. You pretended to be someone else. You watched people struggle and didn't stop it. You watched me. What was that research? No, he said, taking a step closer. It wasn't like that. I didn't expect to find. Don't, she interrupted, her eyes glistening. Don't say it. The corridor seemed to shrink around them. The same light that had once made everything glow now felt harsh and cruel. I thought you were different, she whispered, backing away. But you're just another man who hides behind power. Clara, he said, his voice breaking, please. But she was already walking toward the exit. Don't follow me, Ethan. Go back to your glass office. The sound of her boots faded down the hall, leaving him standing alone in the place where he had first been seen, not as a billionaire, but as a man. Now stripped of both masks, he felt something colder than the winter outside. It wasn't the exposure of his secret. It was the loss of her. The story broke like lightning. By morning, every media outlet in Manhattan carried the same headline: Billionaire CEO pretended to be a janitor. Reporters swarmed outside Hale Technologies, shouting questions about deception, ethics, and betrayal. Some called it genius, others called it insanity. But inside the building, chaos bled through every department. Employees whispered in elevators. Executives scrambled to distance themselves. Clara hadn't returned to work since that night. Ethan sat alone in his office, the first time he had stepped inside since the disguise fell apart. The walls felt foreign, the air colder than he remembered. The desk gleamed polished by hands he now knew belonged to people treated like ghosts. His reflection in the window looked sharper, older, hollowed out by guilt. He had tried to explain himself to the board, had told them the truth that the experiment was meant to expose corruption. But they didn't care about morality. They cared about headlines and shareholders. They suspended Marcus pending investigation, but the scandal had already erupted. As Ethan sat there, his assistant entered nervously. Sir, there's a protest forming outside. Union workers, janitors, and reporters. It's getting heated. Ethan stood. I'll handle it. Sir, that's not safe. It's my mess. I'll clean it up. The words felt ironic, like punishment. By the time he reached the lobby, chants echoed through the glass walls. Justice for workers, no more lies. The crowd was growing, faces wet with rain and fury. Security guards formed a line by the entrance radios buzzing. Ethan spotted Henderson at the far end, trying to control the situation. They want answers, Henderson shouted over the noise. They think you're hiding inside your office. Ethan stepped forward. Then I won't hide. He pushed open the doors and stepped into the storm. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted, Mr. Hale. Was it all a publicity stunt? Did you manipulate your employees for a social experiment? Were you having an affair with a security guard? That last question hit harder than the rain. Ethan froze. Excuse me, the reporter smirked. A source says you grew close to a female employee during your little act. Clara Monroe, correct? The crowd buzzed with murmurs. Ethan's chest tightened. That's a lie, he said firmly. She's not part of this story. Then why did she disappear? Someone shouted. The chant shifted. Where is she? Where is she? Ethan turned and went back. Inside, his jaw clenched. In the boardroom upstairs, Marcus sat smugly across the table, bandaged from an earlier confrontation with the press. You see, Marcus said, your little morality play has turned into a circus. You're suspended, Ethan snapped. Not for long, Marcus said, with a thin smile, unless you can prove otherwise. And considering the data breach happened under your fake janitor act, I'd say you're the one who'll take the fall. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. You leaked client data for personal gain. I have proof. Marcus leaned back. Then why not release it? Maybe because it'll reveal that you were there, dressed like a janitor, meddling in systems you weren't authorized to touch. You can't save face without destroying yourself. The truth of it stung. Marcus wasn't bluffing. If Ethan released the footage, it would confirm the rumors and drag Clara into it. The scandal would stain her forever. As Marcus left, Ethan's phone vibrated. A text appeared from an unknown number. She's in danger. Loading dock now. He ran. The corridors were empty, echoing with the hum of distant alarms. When he reached the basement, smoke drifted through the air. Someone had lit a small fire near the dumpsters. Workers shouted, trying to extinguish it. And there near the loading bay, Clara stood cornered by a man in a hood, his movements jerky, furious. You ruined everything, the man growled. He fired me because of you. Clara held her hands up. You need to walk away. This isn't. The man lunged. Ethan didn't think. He ran forward, shouting her name. The metal pipe in the man's hand swung wildly. Ethan ducked, but the edge caught his shoulder, sending a flash of pain down his arm. Clara grabbed a nearby extinguisher and slammed it against the man's back. He stumbled, cursing, then turned the weapon toward her. Ethan pushed forward again, grabbing the man's wrist. They struggled, slipping on the wet floor. The sound of distant sirens filled the air. Then the pipe swung once more, but this time Clara stepped between them. The impact hit her arm with a sickening crack. She fell against Ethan, gasping, clutching her bleeding hand. He caught her, holding her close, as the attacker fled into the smoke. Clara, he breathed panic, flooding his voice. You're hurt. She winced, her breath shallow. Just a scratch. He pressed his hand against the wound, his heart hammering. Why would you risk yourself for me? She looked up at him, her eyes glistening through the haze. Because you're still human, even if you forget. The words broke something inside him. He held her as the sirens grew louder, the red lights from the fire trucks painting the walls like blood. When paramedics arrived, they rushed to her side, bandaging her arm. Ethan tried to follow, but the security team pulled him aside. Sir, you need medical attention too. No, he said. Take care of her first. From the ambulance doorway, Clara looked at him, her face pale but steady. Don't blame yourself, she said softly. You can't fix people who don't want to change. But I can try, he whispered. She smiled faintly before the doors closed. As the ambulance pulled away, rain began to fall again, extinguishing the small fires still burning in the alley. Ethan stood there, soaked, his blood mixing with the rainwater pooling at his feet. The flashing lights reflected in the puddles, turning the world into a blur of red and white. Henderson appeared beside him. She'll be okay, he said quietly. Ethan nodded, though his voice was gone. I failed her, he muttered. No, Henderson said. You failed yourself first. Now you get to make it right. Ethan looked up at the glowing tower that bore his name. For the first time, it didn't look like success. It looked like penance. He turned toward the street, watching as the ambulance disappeared into the distance, carrying away the only person who had seen through the disguise and found something worth saving underneath. The following days unfolded like a slow collapse. News channels ran the same footage of Ethan helping Clara into the ambulance headlines, twisting the story into scandal. CEO undercover involved in violent incident with female employee. Every word felt like a dagger. Talk shows debated whether it had all been an act of manipulation. Some called him a visionary, others called him a fraud. Clara was in the hospital, her arm fractured her name, now dragged across the internet without her consent. Ethan hadn't seen her since that night. He sent flowers letters apologies that were returned unopened. The board demanded his resignation. Investors pulled out. Employees whispered as he walked past their loyalty, evaporated like smoke. Marcus, though temporarily suspended, had leaked private footage to the press, showing Ethan in his janitor uniform, walking beside Clara, sharing coffee, smiling. The narrative was clear he had used her blurred boundaries, compromised ethics. But the truth burned differently inside him. He hadn't fallen from grace because of greed or deceit. He had fallen because he had felt something real, something fragile, something he couldn't hide. By the end of the week, the building he had once ruled became his courtroom. Journalists lined the lobby. Protesters shouted his name as if it were a curse. Henderson approached him in the elevator. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "The lawyers can handle it." Ethan shook his head. "This isn't about saving my name. It's about owning what I did wrong and what I didn't." The elevator doors opened to the top floor. Cameras waited. The press conference had already begun. Lights flashed, microphones gleamed, the air thick with tension. Ethan stepped to the podium. For a moment, he just looked at them, the faces hungry for blood, the employees who had once bowed to him, the board seated behind, silent and cold. He inhaled slowly. "I wore that uniform because I forgot what it meant to serve." He said, his voice steady but rough. "I built a company that lost its soul while I hid behind glass walls and spreadsheets. I wanted to see the truth, and what I found was worse than I imagined. I saw arrogance, exploitation, indifference, and I saw it because I created the kind of place where those things could thrive." The room was silent except for the hum of cameras. People ask if I regret what I did. I don't regret seeing the truth. I regret waiting this long to face it. He paused, glancing at the front row of reporters, then continued. "I didn't intend to hurt anyone. I didn't go undercover for attention or profit. I did it because I needed to understand what my company had become. But I crossed lines. I blurred trust. And for that, I am sorry, especially to one person who showed me what humanity still looks like." Murmurs rippled across the room. "Her name is Clara Monroe," he said. "She defended someone she thought was a stranger. She stood for decency when no one else did. The only person who defended the janitor was the only one who ever cared for the man behind him." The words hung heavy in the air. Reporters scribbled furiously. Some looked stunned. Others smelled blood. "Are you in love with her?" one shouted. Ethan hesitated, the truth trembling at the edge of his tongue. "I'm in debt to her," he said finally. "She reminded me what it means to see and to be seen. Whether that's love or redemption, I'll leave for her to decide." A single flash went off, then another. Questions erupted, overlapping like thunder. Will you resign? Is this an admission of guilt? Where is Clara Monroe now? Ethan raised his hand for silence. I've already submitted my resignation, effective immediately. The company will continue under new leadership, and every employee from executives to custodians will be given a voice in rebuilding its culture. I failed them once. I won't fail them again. He stepped back from the podium. The cameras clicked like gunfire. Some clapped quietly. Most just stared. As he turned to leave, a reporter shouted, "Do you expect forgiveness?" Ethan stopped but didn't look back. "No," he said, "but I'm learning how to deserve it." He walked out through the side corridor where Henderson waited. "That was either suicide or salvation," Henderson muttered. Ethan gave a small smile. Sometimes they're the same thing. He left the building through the back entrance, slipping into the gray drizzle that blurred the city's edges. The streets were quieter now, the protests dispersed by exhaustion and rain. He walked aimlessly past neon signs and puddles, reflecting fragments of his speech, playing on storefront televisions. He looked like every other man in the city coat collar, up face shadowed, searching for something he'd already lost. That night he returned to his penthouse for the first time in weeks. The place was immaculate, untouched, lifeless. The city stretched below like a constellation he no longer belonged to. On the counter sat the notebook he had carried as Evan Hart the janitor. He flipped through the pages, smudged ink, half-written sentences, fragments of a man trying to find meaning in the smallest acts of kindness. He stopped on the page that read, "She reminded me that being seen isn't the same as being known." He closed it gently, as if afraid the words would vanish. The phone rang, jolting him. It was Henderson again. "Marcus has been arrested," he said. "Internal audits confirmed he was behind the breach and the leak. You're clear." Ethan let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Good," he said quietly. "But it doesn't change what I broke." "Maybe not," Henderson replied, "but it gives you a chance to rebuild." After the call, Ethan walked to the window. The rain had stopped. The city shimmered alive again, indifferent to his fall. He imagined Clara, somewhere in that maze of lights, recovering, healing, hating him maybe all at once. He whispered to the glass, "I hope you're free, even if it's not with me." In that moment, the man who had once owned everything finally understood what it meant to own nothing and to find peace in it. A year passed like a long exhale that never quite ended. The world moved on as it always does, devouring scandals with new ones and leaving only faint echoes behind. Hale Technologies survived the storm, under new management, its logo still shining over the skyline, though Ethan no longer stepped through its doors. He had sold most of his shares and vanished from the circles that once defined him. Some said he moved abroad. Others said he was quietly rebuilding his reputation somewhere else. But the truth was simpler. Ethan Hale had disappeared into the kind of life no one looked twice at. Vermont in winter was quiet. A place of pine trees, frozen lakes, and roads that ended in silence. That was where he found her again. It was raining the night he arrived, soft, persistent, cleansing rain that blurred headlights and turned the world silver. He parked an old truck in front of a small hospital, on the edge of a sleepy town, clutching a folder that had taken him a year to prepare. The sign near the door read Maple County Medical Center. Inside, nurses moved briskly through the corridors, their shoes squeaking against the tile. He saw her before she saw him, standing near the reception desk, wearing the same navy uniform, but with a new badge. Clara Monroe, Security Supervisor. Her arm had healed, though a thin scar still traced down her wrist, like a reminder of that night. Her hair was shorter now, her face leaner, wiser. Time had changed her, but it hadn't dimmed the light in her eyes. Ethan stood still, watching her speak to a nurse, the sound of her laughter faint but steady. For a moment he almost turned away, but the reason he'd come was stronger than his fear. He stepped forward. When she turned, surprise flickered across her face, followed by something unreadable. Ethan. His name fell from her lips like a memory she hadn't decided to keep. "What are you doing here?" He smiled faintly, rainwater dripping from his coat. "I came to clean up the mess I made." She folded her arms. "That's a long trip just to say sorry." "It's not just that," he said, holding out the folder. "I've been working on something, a foundation, for people who lost their jobs unfairly, who were written off by systems they couldn't fight. I called it the Second Chance Foundation." She didn't take the folder. "And you think showing up here makes it right?" "No," he said quietly, "but maybe it's a start." The silence between them filled with the sound of rain tapping the windows. She looked down, her fingers tightening around the badge on her belt. "You hurt me, Ethan, not just with lies, but with the idea that I was part of one." "I know," he said, his voice steady but thick. "You saw me when no one else did, and I repaid that with deceit. But every day since I've tried to build something that honors what you taught me." "And what was that?" she asked softly. "That kindness doesn't need an audience," he said. "That doing good quietly is the loudest way to live." For a moment, neither spoke. Then she sighed, the sound tired, but not cruel. "You really think people change? I don't know," he admitted. "But I think they can learn." "I did." Clara looked at him, the anger in her eyes replaced by something gentler, sadness maybe, or mercy. "You look different," she said finally. "Older." "Peace costs more than money," he said with a faint smile. "Turns out I was overpaying for the wrong things." She almost smiled but caught herself. "You still talk like a philosopher." "Only when I'm nervous," he confessed. The rain outside grew heavier, blurring the streetlights into soft halos. A nurse called Clara's name, but she waved her off, her gaze still fixed on him. "Why now?" she asked. "Why after all this time?" "Because the foundation launches tomorrow," he said, "and I can't start it without you. You once told me you missed feeling like your work mattered. I want you to run it." She blinked, stunned. "Run it?" "You've already been running it in spirit," he said. "I just built the framework." She looked down at the folder, then back at him. "You really mean that?" "More than anything," he said. "You taught me that power isn't control, it's responsibility. I want this foundation to remind people that no one is invisible." She took the folder at last, opening it slowly. Inside were photos, reports, letters, testimonies from people who had been given jobs, shelter, hope. Each one carried the logo of the Second Chance Foundation. She flipped through them, her expressions softening with every page. "You did all this?" she asked. "We did," he said. "You just didn't know it." Her eyes glistened as she closed the folder. "You're still impossible to stay angry at," she whispered. "That sounds like forgiveness. Don't push your luck." They both laughed quietly, the sound fragile but real. He stepped closer, hesitating only a breath away. "Clara, I don't expect anything. I just needed to see you to thank you for not giving up on the world when it gave up on you." She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. You really came all this way. Just for that I came, because I couldn't move on without knowing you were okay," he said. "And because I still believe in what started that night in the hallway, when you told me I wasn't invisible." Her eyes softened the walls she'd built, slowly giving way. She reached out, touching the sleeve of his coat. "Then start with your heart," she said quietly. The rain outside thundered now, echoing like applause against the glass. Ethan smiled, eyes stinging. "Does that mean I get a second chance?" "Maybe," she said, stepping back but not letting go. "But only if you stop at trying to fix everything and just be here." He nodded, his throat tightening. "I can do that." For a long moment they stood by the window, the storm painting silver lines down the glass. No grand music, no crowd, no cameras, just two people standing in the quiet truth of what forgiveness looks like. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low. "I missed you, I know," she said, "but sometimes people have to lose everything before they see what's real." He nodded. "I see it now." She smiled faintly, resting her forehead against the cold glass. "Then maybe that's enough." Outside, the rain softened into mist. Inside, something fragile but powerful began to rebuild itself, two lives once broken, now mending in silence. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel the need to explain or confess or apologize. He just felt grateful to have been seen, to have been forgiven, and to have found in the quiet rain of Vermont a redemption that asked for nothing except truth. A year later, the world looked different, quieter, slower, but somehow fuller. The Second Chance Foundation had grown beyond anything Ethan had imagined. What began as an idea scribbled in a rain-soaked notebook had turned into a national movement. Across America, from Detroit to Dallas, people who had been laid off, wrongfully fired, or forgotten were finding new beginnings. Local papers called it the kindness ripple. For Ethan and Clara, it was more than a project. It was their shared heartbeat. They worked side by side every day, traveling to factories, community centers, and small towns where hope had long stopped visiting. Clara had become the executive director, her leadership both firm and compassionate. She didn't sit behind a desk, she walked the floors, listened to stories handed out, job applications, hugged crying mothers. People respected her, not because she carried a title, but because she carried truth. Ethan had stepped away from the spotlight content to work quietly behind the scenes. He handled logistics funding and sometimes just fixed the leaky faucets at their Vermont office. When reporters asked for interviews, he politely declined, saying this story isn't mine anymore. Their relationship had deepened into something steady, unspoken, and real. They shared the same small rented house near the lake where mornings smelled of coffee and pine. They didn't label what they were. They simply existed in the comfort of being seen. On the anniversary of the foundation's launch, Clara woke up before dawn and found Ethan sitting on the porch watching mist rise from the lake. "You never sleep in," she teased, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Old habits," he said, smiling. "I used to wake up early to check markets. Now I wake up to check if the world's a little kinder." She sat beside him, sipping her coffee. "And is it maybe not enough, but better than it was?" She glanced at him. "You've changed, you know. You smile more, you listen more. You even fix things with your hands, now instead of money." "You changed me," he said simply. She looked away, hiding a small smile. "No, you just remembered who you were." Later that morning, they drove to a factory on the outskirts of Burlington, the foundation's newest success story. A year ago, it had been an abandoned warehouse. Now it buzzed with life, employing dozens of people who'd once been turned away by other companies. Ethan and Clara toured the floor, shaking hands, listening to laughter. A woman approached them, a single mother named Denise, who had been fired from her old job for taking time off to care for her child. "I just wanted to thank you," Denise said, eyes glistening. "I thought my life was over. Now my daughter says she wants to grow up to be like Miss Clara." Clara smiled, hugging her. "Then make sure she grows up stronger than me." When they reached the break room, a young mechanic looked at Ethan curiously. "You really were the CEO, huh?" Ethan chuckled. "Was. And you fell for a security guard?" the man asked with a grin. Ethan laughed softly, glancing at Clara. "No," he said. "I fell for the only person who saw me when I was invisible." Clara rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. They left the factory in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the mountains. On the drive back, Ethan turned on the radio. A local news station was running a segment about the foundation, calling it a quiet revolution of empathy. Clara leaned her head against the window. "A revolution," she murmured. "That's dramatic." "Maybe," he said, "but kindness can be pretty radical." They arrived home just as rain began to fall soft and familiar. Inside, the lights glowed warm. Ethan poured wine, and they sat on the couch, their shoulders touching. "You ever think about the beginning?" he asked. "Which part, the mop or the lies, both?" "Sometimes," she said, "it feels like another life." "It was," he said. "But I'd live it again if it led here." She looked at him, then eyes gentle. "You know, I used to think you were trying to save everyone. Now I see you were just trying to save yourself." "Maybe both," he admitted. She smiled faintly. "Well, you did better the second time around." They sat in silence, the rain pattering softly against the roof. Ethan reached for his notebook, the same one he had written in back then. It was worn, the pages curled and water-stained, but he still used it. He opened it to a blank page and wrote, 1 year later. "The janitor learned to build, not just clean. The woman who guarded doors now opens them for others, and love, the quiet kind, keeps the lights on." Clara read over his shoulder and rested her chin on his shoulder. "You're still a poet," she whispered. "Bad habit. Don't quit it." They stayed like that for a long time, watching the storm outside. Lightning flickered over the lake, casting brief flashes of light across their faces. "You know," she said, breaking the silence, "maybe the world doesn't need perfect people. Maybe it just needs people who try again." "Then we're in the right business," he said. She laughed softly, and the sound wrapped around him like music. When the power flickered, Ethan lit a candle. Its small flame glowed between them, steady and golden. He thought of all the places they had been: the marble floors of Manhattan, the rain in Vermont, the fire in the alley, and how everything had led to this small, quiet moment of peace. He looked at Clara, her face lit by candlelight, her eyes reflecting something stronger than forgiveness. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She met his gaze. "I didn't stay," she said softly. "I just came home." And in that moment, Ethan realized that home wasn't a place or a building or even a second chance. It was a person who saw you, believed in you, and stood beside you while you learned how to begin again. The hall was filled with soft golden light, the kind that turned every reflection into warmth. It had been 5 years since the night the rain had fallen in Vermont. 5 years since a billionaire had laid down his title, and a woman who once guarded empty corridors had learned to guard hearts instead. Tonight they stood together again. Ethan Hale and Clara Monroe at the 5th anniversary gala of the Second Chance Foundation. The event was small, intentionally so. No red carpets, no paparazzi, no flashy lights, just people whose lives had been changed by what they had built. Former janitors, veterans, nurses, factory workers, single parents, all dressed in their best clothes, faces glowing with quiet pride. The banners read, 5 years of hope. Clara stood near the stage greeting guests. Her black dress was simple, elegant, and timeless. She spoke with the same calm strength that once silenced a cruel supervisor and saved a broken man. Ethan watched her from across the room, still stunned by how something as fragile as kindness could survive the storms they'd faced. The foundation had grown beyond them now, with branches in 12 states, hundreds of employees, and thousands of lives touched. Yet tonight, it wasn't about expansion or success. It was about gratitude. As the speeches began, Ethan took his place behind the podium. He glanced at Clara in the front row. Their eyes met, and for a moment the room disappeared. 5 years ago, he began, his voice steady but low. I pretended to clean floors. I thought I was searching for dishonesty in others. What I found was my own blindness. I learned that true leadership isn't about being seen, it's about seeing. The crowd listened in silence. That lesson came from the people who worked when no one was watching, the ones who held this world together in small, unseen ways. And one of them taught me that no one is invisible unless we choose not to look. He paused, emotion catching in his throat. That woman is the reason this foundation exists. She's the reason I'm standing here today. Clara Monroe. Applause filled the room as Clara's name echoed. She smiled, shy and proud, and shook her head slightly, as if to say, "Don't make this about me." But Ethan wasn't finished. "I brought something tonight," he said. He turned and picked up an object from behind the podium, a mop old and worn, but polished with care. The audience laughed softly, not mockingly, but with affection. "This," he continued, "was the first thing I ever used honestly. It reminded me that dignity doesn't come from status or wealth. It comes from doing something well, no matter how small. And tonight I'd like to return it where it belongs." The room quieted. Ethan walked down the steps, mop in hand, and approached Clara. The light caught her face, and in her eyes he saw the same woman who had once said, "You're not invisible." He stopped in front of her, and for a long moment simply looked at her, as if memorizing her anew. 5 years ago, he said softly enough for only her to hear, "You found me in the hallway, lost and hiding. You spoke to me like I mattered when I didn't deserve it. You risked your job to do the right thing. You saved my life that night at the dock, and every day since you've saved it again." She swallowed hard, tears glinting. "Ethan." He knelt slowly, the mop still in his hand, and reached into his pocket. The crowd hushed. He held out a small box, opening it to reveal a ring's simple golden set with a single stone that caught the light like a drop of dawn. 5 years ago, I pretended to clean floors," he said, his voice breaking. "Tonight, I ask if you'll build a home with me." Clara covered her mouth, her breath trembling. The crowd murmured, but no one dared move. Ethan continued his words, carrying through the quiet like a vow. "You once told me that people forget what it's like to be tired. I don't want to forget anymore. I don't want to forget where I came from, what I almost lost, or the woman who taught me what love looks like when the lights go out. So this isn't a proposal from a billionaire. it's a promise from a man who will never stop trying to be worthy of what you saw in him. Clara's eyes filled her hands, shaking as she took the ring. For a heartbeat she couldn't speak. Then she smiled through tears and whispered, "And I promise to keep seeing you even when the world forgets who you are." The applause that followed wasn't loud or wild. It was gentle, reverent, the kind that felt like a prayer. Ethan rose, and she stepped into his arms. For a long moment they just held each other, the room fading into the background. Outside, rain began to fall light and steady, as if the sky itself remembered their story. Later that evening, after the guests had gone and the music had faded, they stayed behind to help the staff tidy up. It was Clara's idea, of course. "You can't forget your roots," she teased, handing him a broom. "Yes, ma'am," he said, grinning as he took it. They moved through the empty hall, sweeping confetti and picking up glasses, laughing quietly. It was absurdly ordinary and absolutely perfect. At one point, Ethan leaned on the broom and watched her from across the room. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way her laughter filled the silence, the way her eyes still held light even after all the darkness they'd walked through. "You know," he said, for someone who never liked fancy events, "you make them look like art." "Flattery won't get you out of sweeping," she said, smirking. "It wasn't flattery," he said, stepping closer. "It was truth." She looked up, and in her eyes was that same softness that had saved him once, the look of someone who saw the man, not the name. "Then sweep faster, philosopher," she said with a grin. He laughed, and together they finished the last corner of the room. When it was done, Ethan picked up the mop, the old one he had kept all these years now, gleaming with a golden handle. "You kept it?" she asked. "Some promises deserve reminders," he said. She stepped closer, resting her hand over his. "Then let's make a new one." "What's that?" "Whatever happens next, we keep choosing kindness. Every single day." "Deal," he said, and kissed her forehead. Outside, the rain glistened against the pavement, each droplet catching the streetlight like a spark. They walked out together into the night, no cameras, no stage, just two people who had finally learned that redemption doesn't arrive in thunder or applause. It arrives quietly in the choice to love again. As they reached the car, Clara paused, tilting her face up toward the rain. "Funny," she said, "it started with rain." "And it ends with it," he said. "No," she whispered, taking his hand. "It begins again." He smiled, threading his fingers through hers. Together they walked down the street, the mop still in his other hand, leaving faint footprints in the wet pavement that shimmered under the city lights. Behind them, through the glass windows of the hall, the Foundation's banner still glowed faintly in gold. The Second Chance Foundation building, hope one soul at a time. Ethan turned once more to look at it and whispered under his breath, "True love doesn't see the suit, it sees the soul beneath it." Clara squeezed his hand and they disappeared into the rain. Two ordinary hearts who had once been invisible, now shining seen and finally home. If this story touched something quiet in your heart, take a moment before you scroll away. Close your eyes and remember the last time someone truly saw you, not for what you owned, not for what you could give, but simply for who you were, when the world wasn't watching. That's what this story was always about. Not wealth, not redemption in grand gestures, but the quiet kind, the kind that grows from a single act of kindness in a cold hallway under fluorescent light. Somewhere out there tonight, someone is cleaning an office while everyone else sleeps. Someone is holding on to hope even when it's heavy. Someone is still choosing decency over pride. And maybe, like Ethan and Clara, they're not invisible at all. They're the light we've all been too busy to notice. If you believe, as I do, that love is found in the most ordinary corners of life, in a shared cup of coffee, in a stranger's gentle word, in the courage to forgive, then let's keep these stories alive. Leave a comment telling where you're watching from, or share this video with someone who once gave you a second chance. Tell them thank you. Tell them they mattered, because sometimes one story can remind us that humanity isn't lost, just hidden under the noise. And maybe tonight, as the rain falls somewhere over a city that never stops running, someone will look up from their tired reflection and realize they were never invisible. If this story meant something to you, don't just watch, carry it forward. Share it, talk about it, keep believing in the quiet power of kindness. The world needs more of that. And if you've ever felt unseen, remember this. Someone out there will notice you, not for your title, your mistakes, or your past, but for the soul that keeps showing up. You are not invisible. You are the reason love stories like this one exist. So stay a little longer, breathe a little deeper, and if you can be someone's second chance today,